The early 1900s, a time of immigration to America of rich and poor, of new developments everywhere. The first radio transmission was sent across the Atlantic. Electricity was harnessed by Thomas Edison, who also founded his own movie company. In America, the newspapers were looking for juicier and more exciting stories, which may not always have been equally close to the truth. As Edison continued creating films, these companies started to see the merit of both the static and the moving image, a new way to convey the news, to tell the public about what was happening in the world. These images were especially efficient during the war. The dead and wounded could never be described accurately with only words. Now, everybody could see for themselves what was happening. These men were being mutilated, torn apart for the sake of killing. These were the stories that the newspapers were looking for, horrors that would shock the public, leave them breathless, struggling to comprehend. But it was not what the government was looking for. The government wanted to have the public believe the opposite, wanted to dress up the war with roses and ribbons. Besides the censorship and journalism, propaganda was used a lot during the Great War, to hide the horrible truth and just to promote it. This truth included the suffering of the soldiers watching their friends die and gargle for breath from the gas and the long, long waiting. All the newspapers were controlled by the government so that the people would only see what the government wanted them to see. In this way, the government controlled the people and prevented them from protesting against the war. In addition, they made young men volunteer for the war, which would increase the size of their army and their chance to win. Another reason for propaganda was to prevent truthful information about tactics and positions of soldiers to leak out, because it would surely be used by the enemy to crush them. All the journalists' lives were tough, but the lives of the journalists that weren't appointed by the government were even tougher. The journalists that were appointed by the government were reporting from Europe, but what they showed to the people about the war wasn't the real story. Whatever they wrote down, they had to send over to a censor who would change the information as he pleased, trying to convince the strong young men to join the army, as well as trying to convince the women and the men that were too old or too young to also try to convince these able-bodied men to join the army. These journalists lived in constant danger as they hung around the battlefields, in constant fear of shells and bullets. The lives of the illegal journalists were even harder. Whereas the appointed journalists only had to worry about being shot by the enemy, the illegal ones also had to watch the side they were on. They had a good reason. If these illegal journalists were caught, they would be threatened with a death penalty if they weren't convicted immediately. If they were then caught again, they would definitely be killed. Another casualty of the war. This is the story of one of these journalists in the war, called Philip Gibbs. He was born in 1877 in London and quickly developed a taste for literature. After that, he soon turned to writing himself. He also started writing journalistic articles and was hired by the Daily Chronicle, one of the main newspapers in London. As tensions started to rise in Europe, he was sent to Germany to report. But when war actually broke out and Germany became the enemy, he was transferred to France to report from the Western Front. He was arrested, but sent back as an official reporter from the British Empire. The horrors he witnessed there would have remained with him his entire life, and the worst part would have been that he was never able to tell anybody, forced to lie by his country's government, condemned to silence by his wish to scream.